Welcome to the third and final day of Data Summit Connect. My name is Mary D. Ojala. I'm the conference program director for this conference and other conferences produced by Information Today, Inc. And this morning, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker, Clay Jackson, who is Senior Database Systems Sales Engineer with Quest Software. And he tells me he's been there for about 8 years and has also worked for a number of other companies up in the Seattle area. So I should also say that we will be recording this session and it will go live as a video on YouTube probably sometime next week. So let me turn this over to Clay. And Clay, you want to share your screen? And
Yep.
He will be talking about moving your data to the cloud. Location matters.
Well, thank you very much, Mary D. And welcome. Good morning. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all happen to be. As Mary D said, I'm Clay Jackson. I've been with Quest about 8 years as a database sales engineer. And I'm going to talk today about cloud and why location matters when you're moving into the cloud. If you're like everybody else, you're trying to move your databases to other places and get the most out of your data and your databases, minimizing infrastructure costs. Do more with less, speed and flexibility and access to the data. But you're also a little bit unsure about performance and security across your platforms. Well, the good news is you're not alone. Look at some of the studies that have been done. Gartner keeps telling us that business success is now tied to IT efficiency and flexibility. 20 years ago, IT was mostly accounting and back office operations, warehouse management, that kind of thing. Today, we're right in the middle of things. Ask Amazon how much they lose per second if their web server or some of their e-commerce sites go down. And I'm sure most of you are all in the same sort of bind with a lot of your businesses. So it's very, very important. Uptime and availability and flexibility are very important. And of course, those things become even more important when you start thinking about outsourcing that or moving your data to some vendor or something other than you have control over. So let's talk a little bit first about Cloud 101. This is probably going to be a review for most of you, but make sure we get all on the same page here and talking about the same sorts of things. What are some of the essentials of cloud? Why is the cloud such a big deal, and why do we want to even look at it? Well, provides on-demand computing resources, on-demand IT. Very easy to scale up, scale down. You can spin up a new server in sometimes literally as much as a few seconds or a few minutes. It's got very, very broad access. Anybody can access it. Lots of people can set things up in the cloud. We have departments now that are doing their own IT with cloud servers and setting things up. It's very, very easy to set up a server or a service in AWS or Azure or any one of the other cloud providers. The resource pooling. We can share resources. We don't have to buy that $1 million piece of iron and have some place to sit it to provide our resources to make our business spin. Elasticity, again, we can go scale up, scale down, turn things off, scale up a development project. When the development project is over, you turn your cloud machines off and walk away, and you're not paying any more money for those services. So it's very, very easy to scale up and down. And the service is measured. You pay as you go. You pay for what you use and no more. You don't have, again, the big expensive iron sitting in the data center where it's got to be cooled and powered and all those wonderful things. So we talk about cloud. How do we talk about cloud with service models? We got software as a service. Salesforce is probably a good example of that, or any of the other software offerings that are being run entirely in the cloud. You buy the application, you buy the service, and that's all you need to worry about. Again, no infrastructure, no big iron, nothing to worry about. Platform as a service maybe you have an Oracle database or a SQL Server database or a database you need to run and maintain, and you've got some application data you need to use, or you're doing analytics. But again, you don't need to worry about the operating system and all the bits and pieces underneath it. You don't need to house the hardware and do all of those things. And then finally, infrastructure as a service, where you're just buying the hardware platform from someone in the cloud, some vendor in the cloud, a lot like remote hosting or other things you were maybe used to from past experiences, but a little different in that now you can stand a server up in 5 minutes as opposed to a day and a half or 2 days, or letting someone else have to rack and stack a server for you. You can stand up your virtual server in just a very few minutes with cloud services. Cloud deployment models. Got private cloud, where whatever you do is all yours. Doesn't depend on where it's located. This is one thing some people confuse a little bit. Private cloud doesn't necessarily mean it has to be located on your site. It can still be located in the cloud or in some other service providers area. At Amazon, when they do private cloud for government organizations, they actually have them in separate cages or separate pieces of buildings in their data center, so people without the appropriate clearances can't get at them and can't manage them. So the hardware and the infrastructure is all yours. No one else is accessing it. You have private network connections in and out, and so on. Community cloud, first set up by some community colleges and colleges in New York, and also by the three-letter agencies based in Washington. There is an intelligence community cloud that they use, that they can share data among themselves and connections and so on among themselves, but again, it's isolated from the outside world and from people that they don't want to have access to. Lots of community clouds go around. Again, you find those primarily in government or in other places where you have multiple organizations under some centralized leadership or some centralized organization at the top of the structure. And then finally, public cloud. There is wide open. The infrastructure is all available. You're sharing infrastructure. You're sharing bits and pieces. You have your own virtual machine or your own software instance if you're running software as a service or platform as a service. But the hardware underlying it is going to be shared, and the resources, things like networks and so on, are going to be shared underneath that. They'll be isolated virtually and isolated in software, but not necessarily isolated physically. And then finally, something we're going to spend a lot of time talking about is this hybrid model. Maybe you've got some data that you think is too sensitive and too important and too critical to be moved into a cloud infrastructure anywhere. So you do what Oracle calls cloud at customer, and what other companies are calling on-premise cloud. You set up your own cloud environment. You still get all the benefits of the cloud in terms of deployment and ease of use and elasticity and resource pooling and so on, but it's all in your own environment and you have control over it. And then you might take some other things that aren't quite so mission critical and aren't quite as important and move those off to either a private cloud in someone's infrastructure, or maybe a public cloud or a community cloud, depending on what level of access and security you feel comfortable with. So, and again, note here that location is not really important for any of these things. The actual physical location of the servers is not really making up any of these models. Typically, you see hybrid, where you're going to have an on-premise environment, but you can have hybrid. You could have a private cloud, and then for some things, and use public cloud somewhere, but still be hosted by Amazon or Microsoft or whatever. So again, location is the physical location of servers is not the important part. It's the location of your data and where that is relative to these various cloud deployment models. We look at stages of cloud adoption. We start out at the lower left there with individual projects. Companies will say, well, let's take this project and move it in the cloud. We're going to get our feet wet in the cloud. We've got a new project. Doesn't use a lot of shared data, nothing that horribly important, nothing company confidential or critical to the company or critical to our customers. We'll put that in the cloud and see what happens. Most companies are now beyond that phase, but there are still some that are just barely dipping their toes in the water and getting feet wet. And then you move into some foundational activities. You build a foundation for building even more things in the cloud later. You may build some virtual networks. You may build some other things in the cloud. You may actually set up a private connection between your systems and your data center and a cloud vendor, and you start doing some migrations. And then once you've done those migrations, you wind up with reinventing your systems, retiring the old technical debt, and moving forward. Now, of course, if you're a startup and you've been in business for probably less than the last 5 or 10 years, you may be completely in the cloud to begin with. Why, if you're a startup offering a service or offering a particular set of widgets or something that's unique, you don't need the hardware, you don't need all those things on site. So you'll see startups will be typically the earliest adopters of cloud, particularly the startups dealing with Internet of Things and some sensors and things like that. They're going to be in the cloud to begin with, and they literally know no other computing environment except the cloud. So what are some of the challenges about moving to cloud and making those things happen? Here's the top cloud initiatives for 2020. And you see the top one there is optimize existing use of cloud cost savings. A lot of times, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, you get a mandate that says, let's move everything to the cloud, or let's move to the cloud. So you start moving applications to the cloud, and then suddenly you get your first bill from your cloud provider, and it's double or triple what you thought it was because you didn't look at things like turning development machines off overnight when you're not using them, or whenever the developers aren't there, or network ingress and egress charges, loading data to and from the cloud, things of that nature. And oh my goodness, now you've spent a lot more money than you intended in the cloud. So you need to start optimizing that, look at that. Migrating more workloads to the cloud. Again, the more you can migrate, the more the potential for savings is. It's not always a real savings. You need to look at that and think about that closely and make sure that you understand what you're getting into. If your cloud provider charges extensively for network ingress, loading data into the cloud, and you have an IoT operation or some sort of operation where you're going to be loading a bunch of external data into your cloud environment, maybe that cloud or that cloud vendor is not the best thing for you because you're going to be spending a lot of money on those network ingress or egress charges. Or maybe you've got some sizing issues and some things you need to worry about in terms of making sure that your virtual machines in the cloud are sized correctly, or that they're elastic enough so they turn them off or turn them back on. A lot of the cloud vendors now are doing Lambda or so-called serverless architectures, so you really do only pay for what you use when you use it. But again, you have to watch those and make sure that's out there. Expanded use of containers. That's another technology that's up and coming. It's again part of really now almost built into all the cloud offerings. When you start doing that, you can use containers rather than full servers. Progressing to cloud first, making sure that all your things are in the cloud first. Although there's some corporations and some things you just never want to move to the cloud. At a conference last year, I spoke with the CTO of a very large medical center in New England, and he indicated to me, he said he did not think that electronic medical records, at least for his organization, would move to the cloud ever, at least during his tenure. They felt they were too critical and too sensitive to move off-premise into a cloud. Now, they had cloud at customer. They were an Oracle customer. They had cloud at customer for a lot of things, on-premise clouds, and they were most certainly doing those. But in terms of moving to a model hosted by someone else, he didn't think that was ever going to happen. So still some security there. And we see some other things further down the line. CI/CD, DevOps, expand the public clouds we use. Lots of concern about putting all your eggs in one basket, some of those things. And then expand the use of cloud MSP and so on. So lots of different things going on in the cloud and lots of different projects you might run into or get involved in. So what are some of the broader challenges? Security is one of them. Lack of visibility, theft of data or a data breach, lack of control. you've got your data in transit now. You're moving data out of your environment, sometimes over the internet if you're not using a private connection to the cloud, and then the cloud provider. There was a case not too long ago of a major hospital organization that moved a lot of their not their electronic medical records, but their patient analytic data. It still contains patient data and still private data, and they moved it from an on-prem environment where everything was locked down, and they had to have their researchers all on one of their sites and using desktop computers and so on. They moved it into a cloud environment where things were suddenly accessible over the internet, and now their researchers could all work from home. And of course, with COVID, that's happening as well. People are working from home and using laptops and using other machines that are not located on your premise behind your guns and guards and gates. And so they're now subject to theft and security issues and so on. In the case that I was citing, one of the medical researchers had a laptop stolen that had a bunch of patient and employee confidential data on it. And they're now dealing with the consequences of that. So, thefts and breach can become much more possible. The flip side of that, though, is that, I would wager that Amazon probably has more people working on fundamental security than any other organization, except maybe one of the Fortune 100 companies that's got their own huge IT staff, their own environment. So, if you purchase infrastructure as a service or anything above infrastructure as a service from any of the major cloud vendors, you're going to get a system that's patched and up to date, and the employees of that company are keeping track of the latest operating system patches and the latest vulnerabilities and so on. And they're going to insulate you from all those and make sure that you're not subject to any of those kinds of problems. Whereas if in your own on-premise environment, you've probably got at least one server that hasn't been rebooted in 5 years and may have some old software on it that nobody knows about or is paying attention to. So that's a little more difficult to deal with. And then, of course, there's compliance. Particularly with HIPAA, there are actually HIPAA regulations and HIPAA specifications that say, if you have a third-party data supplier or data host, those third parties have to comply with HIPAA and be available. You have to understand and know that they're compliant with HIPAA and then demonstrate that to your regulators. So security is always going to be a challenge wherever you are, but it gets to be even more of a challenge if you wind up in the cloud. Performance is another challenge. Network bandwidth. You start distributing data and you don't know where it is. It might be anywhere in the world. We had a case one time not too long ago with a customer who had their on-premise data center in San Jose, and when they started in the cloud, they were working in a West Coast US cloud, but cloud vendor, unbeknownst to them, decided to move their data and their data center to Singapore, and all of a sudden they had this huge network latency they hadn't planned on that was out there. So that can definitely be a problem, bandwidth and latency. Disk space, again, when you get what you pay for and you use that, but if you haven't provisioned your cloud correctly, you may either run out of disk space or find you're having to buy more disk space when you least expected it. Same thing with CPU cycles and memory. Kind of standard things that you're going to have to worry about, and you're going to have to worry about those even with software as a service. For a lot of the vendors, even when you're buying software as a service, you have to configure the underlying machine and tell them, maybe not in terms of IOPS and memory and CPU cycles, but in terms of things like, how many salesmen I'm going to have accessing Salesforce, how many customers am I going to have in Salesforce, how many transactions, how many orders am I going to place through Salesforce. And if you suddenly have an increase in business, that's great, but now maybe the service you purchased wasn't up to that and adequate for that, and so you're going to have to go out and renegotiate that or repurchase those services. So you need to again, kind of make sure that you're on top of that and keeping track of that. And it does take someone to manage it, someone who knows what they're doing about managing that. Governance and control, we talked about that. Compliance, all sorts of regulations out there that, the regulators don't care where your data is or who's hosting it. They just want to make sure it's secure. Sarbanes-Oxley, in particular for that, but also PCI and HIPAA. As I said, HIPAA's actually got some very specific regulations about hosted data and what happens when your data moves beyond your immediate control. So you need to be careful with those things and look at those. And also control, what we're seeing in the international world is that a lot of countries, particularly in the EU, have restrictions on transnational data flow, what data can be stored where. So you need to make sure your cloud provider isn't going to pick up your data today that's in California and move it to Singapore tomorrow. So you make sure that's not going to happen. You've got to be a little savvy about all those things and keep all those things in mind when you do your migration to cloud. So what does that all boil down to? Well, the location matters. And by location, what I'm referring to here is the kind of cloud you get and where that data is located within the cloud, physically and from a control and sort of ritual standpoint. Just like real estate, right? You've got nice location, great things. You can address some challenges with it, but it may cause some more challenges. And one size does not necessarily fit all. Again, if you got a fairly compute-intensive application that's not doing a lot of networking, having your users in San Jose and your data in Singapore might not be so bad. But if you're trying to do order entry or real-time warehouse management or something like that, that may be not so good. You might have some problems there and some issues there. So choosing it wisely. Okay, what do you need to consider to do that? We've talked about a lot of them. Challenges specific to the project, and this is going to be specific to a project. Again, you might have one thing where you're doing a lot of analytics on your data. You're crunching the data and maybe comparing it to external demographics and some other things that you can do in some of Azure Analytics and things like that. And so, the physical location in your data, where it is in the world, is probably not as important as if it's a real-time shop floor manufacturing environment, for example. There, you're probably going to want your data in the same building or at least fairly close on the same high-speed network as your manufacturing facility, so you're getting the data in real time. Same thing with patient care, electronic medical records. If you're managing an environment where you have all sorts of monitoring equipment and so on connected to a network, you're not going to want that having to go write data to a cloud that's on in a data center that's on the other side of the world. It's probably not going to be the most effective for you. Compliance. Again, HIPAA is a big one. PCI, SOX, a lot of different regulators out there depending on your organization. Every company is subject to some sort of regulation these days. Availability. Are you in a situation where you need to do availability across different zones in the cloud, the different data centers? You want to make sure your data is replicated into at least 2 different data centers in different parts of the U.S. in case something happens to one part. And cost. How much is all this going to cost you in terms of reliability, in terms of redundancy, network traffic, all those kind of things. So what are some of the alternatives? Looking at your alternatives, the deployment and the service models are always going to be the key, right? You always look at that. Again, sometimes your physical location can be important. If you need your data behind guards, guns, and gates, you need that. Either you're a government organization, or you're dealing with highly sensitive information like patient data or things like that. I was just reading the other day that medical records are one of the most expensive things you can buy on the dark web. People are more interested in medical records than even things like credit card numbers and so on. And so there's a huge demand for that. So you want to be very careful with those. And then network traffic, we talked about that. We've talked about that kind of at length. And then finally, software as a service is almost always going to be remote. Okay, when we're buying software as a service, you can buy Salesforce on-prem and some other things like that, but those are very expensive and not usually what people look at as a first deployment. You're going to be doing that remotely to begin with. So public cloud, the first alternative. It's the least expensive because you're sharing the most resources. Everything is kind of out there. You're protected via software primarily, and virtualization and things like that. But you're going to be sharing hardware and some resources, so it is going to be the least secure. Now, on the other hand, it's the easiest for expansion and contraction because you've got that great big public resource, right? And so you can spin up, spin down, scale out, scale up depending on what you need to do. Network traffic may be an issue. Bandwidth, latency, and costs. Again, we've seen a lot of companies going to virtual private networks or private networks, private dedicated connections between their cloud provider and their own networks. So it looks like the cloud data is on your network. Again, that's going to depend on your size and the complexity of your organization. And your resources really still aren't unlimited. Again, you've got to pay for them. And at some point, you may bump up against a place where your cloud provider is going to say, hey, the server you're on is now over allocated. So we're going to have to move you to a different server. And that may be an outage or maybe something else you need to talk about and look at. Community cloud is the next one you might want to look at. It's a little more secure than public, maybe a lot more secure than public in terms of external connections, but you do have now people in your community that might do something. A breach in one piece of the community may result in a breach or the possibility of a breach across the whole community. Again, you've got some easy expansion and contraction, but there may be some limits. It's probably going to cost more. And data sharing is going to be easier. You can move data to and from your different organizations. If you're in a large organization like a government, you can share data across those government silos and between pieces of your organization. So things are going to be easier that way. And network traffic is still going to be a concern. You've still got bandwidth and cost and latency issues that you may run into in that sort of environment. Next, let's see, we got software as a service. That's going to almost always be remote, so you've got no infrastructure cost. That's great. Again, less security. Now you're relying completely on Salesforce. I'm picking on Salesforce a lot, but that's just because they're big and everybody knows them. You know, it's easy to kind of roll off the tongue. But there are lots of other cloud providers out there in that arena. You know, Taleo, all the different payroll vendors. So I'm not picking on Salesforce for any particular reason other than that they're one of the biggest. You've got less security than you would if you're doing it yourself because, again, you're dependent on those organizations. Less control. Is the data really yours? You need to read your agreement with the cloud vendor very carefully. Some of that data may be shared or may not be yours, particularly if you're using demographic data and pulling in demographic data for like census tract data for analysis or analytics or things like that. You may not own the data you think you do, or you may be giving up rights to your data if you upload it to cloud, depending on how you're doing that. And you've still got some network traffic concerns and so on, and you want to make sure you take that into consideration and make sure your salespeople, for example, are probably want to be located in the same region as your Salesforce system. Platform as a service. Again, that's almost always remote. Some reduced infrastructure costs. Security is still a concern. Control is still a concern, just as they were in some of the other environments. You've still got that platform that you're underlying at. That database is now not yours. Is data really yours? One of the things you might want to consider, and we actually had this happen to a client of ours. If you're 1-800-Flowers, and this didn't happen to 800-Flowers, but it happened to others, as I say, if you're 1-800-Flowers, you don't want your cloud provider taking your network down to a single point of failure on the weekend before Mother's Day, the week before Mother's Day, because that's going to be your biggest day and your biggest week, and if you have a failure during that time, that could be critical for your environment. But if your cloud provider has decided, oh, I'm going to do a software upgrade that week, or I'm going to, do a hardware upgrade, and so some of my redundancy is going to go away or something like that, you need to know about that, and you need to be on top of that and make sure you maybe suggest to your cloud provider, hey, that's not really a good idea for my business, or my business is so critical during that time that I need to move to another set of servers, and you need to make sure that I have all the redundancy I'm paying for. So uh, those are some of the second and third order things you have to look at and be aware of when you're moving to cloud. You don't have control over those things anymore, or at least not direct control. You need to work through your cloud vendor to make sure those things happen and happen correctly. Again, is data really yours? Possible network traffic concerns. You're still moving data to and from that platform. You need to extract a lot of data from it. That data ingress and egress charges are going to be right up there. So you need to, again, worry about that. Infrastructure gives you probably the most control. It can be remote or on-prem. It's basically the same as today's hosting. You're buying a server or a piece of bare metal from someone, some cloud provider, and it's still very scalable. You can scale up and scale down. Even cloud at customer, you can do that. Cloud on-premise, you can do that. It's going to be the most secure because you've got it, you can have it in your own data center and your own environment, and also you have less layers to worry about, and you can specify things like, yeah, I want my own private network or my own connections to this particular machine. So as I said, it gives you the most control, but there are going to be more internal costs. You're going to have a system administrator and maybe a database administrator and some other people watching that and paying attention to that. Not that you don't in the other environments, but it can be collateral duties, or they don't have to be quite as knowledgeable about those things, so a little bit less. A few items that have been in the news lately and some things that have been happening in this arena. This one is kind of old news now, but Microsoft and Oracle have actually gotten together and they're cross-connecting, interconnecting Azure and Oracle Cloud. They have data centers in the same cities, and they've put high-speed networking in their environment, between those two clouds. Now, why did they do that? Why would two arch enemies like Microsoft and Oracle get together? Well, it's a win-win for both of them, right? Microsoft has a great analytics platform and a great BI. Power BI is everybody knows, everybody uses, and there's lots of analytics going on in Azure. And Oracle's been kind of lagging in it. They're catching up. They're catching up very quickly, but they're not quite in the same space. And there's certainly a user community out there that's very loyal and dedicated to the Microsoft analytics tools. The flip side of that is that Oracle's got great ERP systems. They've got Fusion, they've got Taleo, they've got HCM, they've got all the different bits and pieces of the services and things, the software as a service or infrastructure as a service or on-prem. They've got all of that available. So now the question is, how do you get that data out of your Oracle database and into a Microsoft environment? So rather than having people say, well, gee, I really need to be able to do real-time analytics on my data, so I'd better move my Oracle database into the Azure cloud so I can have access to the Microsoft Analytics. Now with this interconnect, Oracle can say, well, gee, you don't really need to do that. You don't need to move your big Oracle database out of our environment. You can leave it in our environment and still ship the data very quickly over to Microsoft. And flip side, Microsoft can say, well, you've got access to all this information. Why move your analytics out of Power BI that all your customers know and love? Leave it here, and you can still access your data at very high speed through the interconnect. So that's kind of why they did that, and we're actually seeing more and more of that as things go along. Some other interesting things that have happened here, again, the olive branch, Oracle and VMware, right? Who would have thought about that one 5 years ago, that Oracle and VMware would be getting together, offering kind of a single support model for VMware to move your stuff to and from the cloud using that. So that's kind of an interesting development as well. And same thing, customers out there that don't want to move from their current infrastructure will want to move around and have the ability to move from one environment to another. And finally, the limitations I was talking about, data centers are finite in size and capability. And when they hit those limits, it can be a long time before you can get beyond those limits and see what's going on. Although again, the cloud vendors can probably scale up a lot faster than an individual corporation can, but even so, data centers, as I say, have physical size limits. So what's the answer to all this? And let's talk about this in some more detail. Hybrid, right? It's all of the above. You're getting the kind of the best of both worlds. You can have cloud in one place, on-premise computing, your cloud on-prem, or you can be in the cloud but still have maybe a private cloud for some things that you don't want subject to disclosure, you need regulations around, or you need to make sure you have it secure and not accessible anywhere else. So it can be the best of all worlds. It's not going to completely eliminate your on-premise costs if you stay on-prem, or your costs for infrastructure, but it's going to reduce those. It's going to be the most resource intensive because now you've got to manage all these bits and pieces and the interconnection between those bits and pieces. Don't forget that. That's going to be important along the way, but it does allow you to address security and network concerns, and it's going to put the data where it's needed. Okay. Again, if you're doing real-time manufacturing in San Jose, you don't want your data in Singapore. You want the data next to your manufacturing plant in Singapore, in San Jose. So maybe you have a cloud at customer for your manufacturing environment, but you put your ERP in Singapore, where your headquarters is, or some things are cheaper and less expensive. So you can do that, but you keep the data where you need it and where it's closest to the customer. We see that a lot in our data replication environments, where you want to make sure the data, the things that need access to data are in the places where the data needs to be. So what sort of tools are you going to look at when you're in this hybrid environment? Replication. Keep your data synchronized in multiple places so that, again, you can have that same data in San Jose and in Singapore, kept up to date in near real time. Again, the network latencies are going to get you there, but you at least have copies of the data so that your access to that data by the users that need it is going to be as fast as it possibly can be. You can also mitigate some migration issues, take care of downtime, eliminate that downtime by having a replica copy before you start your actual migration, and make sure the replica is up to speed and up to date. You can stop replicating sensitive data. Suppose you've got, again, in a medical environment, you've got your patient data and the things like, the patient name and dose of the drug they took and the outcome, things like that. And you want to do some clinical analysis with that. You want to analyze that data and see what doses of drugs might be most effective. You don't need patient identifying information to be able to do that. So you take that clinical data that doesn't have the patient information, and you move that, copy that, replicate it to some other server. You've still got access to data in real time, you know what's going on, but you're not replicating the sensitive data, so that other server, you've got the cloud environment, your analytics environment is not subject to HIPAA because of that. And you can also mitigate access issues. Again, keeping the data close to your customers and close to where it's needed cuts down on the network latency, and also may cut down on ingress and egress charges that cloud vendors have. So keeping your data in a local database, even cloud at customer or on-prem cloud, will mitigate the costs of moving the data across the network, or you move it across the network only once instead of multiple times. Data analysis tools, look at those and use those to find sensitive data, mask and redact that sensitive data. Develop data models so you understand where your data lives and where it is, what data is related to what other data. Don't want to find yourself in the situation that one of our customers did, where you've got a centralized master data repository in one building in a downtown area. You've got branch offices scattered throughout the state, around the country, that rely on that master data. But it's great now because you have your master data in one place. You can keep track of it. You can keep it updated. And then somebody comes along and cuts both the network connections into your building. Now that data is no longer available to anybody external. Your data analysis tools are going to build that data model for you and tell you that employee number and employee information is related to information in these other tables and these other applications and how they're interrelated and interact, and then you can discover that and say, oh, well, maybe I'd better replicate that master data to another database somewhere else in case my main database goes down. You know where those pieces of sensitive data are, and you know where the replications are, and what the ramifications are, and where they're where the relationships are between the data. And you can also, from the data analysis tool, generate and execute scripts that are going to go extract your data or manipulate your data and play with it. So you're probably going to want to look at some data analysis tools to help you decide where you're going to go with the cloud environment. And then performance monitoring. You want to monitor your performance in the cloud and on-prem on an ongoing basis to make sure you're getting the performance you need. You want to be proactive, so you don't want the salespeople calling you and saying, I can't enter an order, or I tried to enter an order and it took me 5 minutes. You want to know that ahead of time and know what's going on in both your cloud and your on-premise environments, and then you're going to identify those issues. Test changes. When you make a change, what is that change going to do to your environment? If you have a baseline, you can take care of that and figure that out. And that kind of leads into the next set of tools, which are benchmarking tools. Capture your workloads. You're considering moving the application from on-prem into the cloud. Capture the workload from your on-prem application, stand up a test application in the cloud, move that workload over there, run it, and see what happens. You test your workloads in new environments without having to worry about, what's happening where and how that data is being moved. You do that before you actually make your move. That way, you know what you're getting into. So in summary, cloud migrations are a journey. Location of that data is important. Where it is relative to other bits of data and other applications in your network, where it is physically, but again, where it is relative to the other pieces you're going to use and need it is the important piece. The physical location is the actual physical location is less important than the relative location and where it is relative to all of the other pieces. Not all clouds are equal. You've got different expectations, different strengths and weaknesses of all environments. You're probably going to wind up in a hybrid environment at some point, sort of whether you like it or not. Remember the slide, the workload slide we talked about, the projects coming up, and one of the top projects coming up was the ability to move to more than one cloud. That way also you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. If Amazon has an outage and you've got data in Azure, you're backing up your data to Azure, you can still use that data. We actually have some customers doing that. They're wanting to have replica data in Azure from AWS and vice versa. It's not just one or the other, but they're all going to be in that same boat. And processes and tools can help. You want to have your tools out there that can help you on that. And for more about some of those tools, my colleague John Bucknell is giving a presentation this afternoon that talks about just that and some of the tools that Quest has that can help you do that little sales pitch there. And that's the end of the formal presentation. I'd be happy to take some questions and answers here. We've got about 15 minutes left in the hour.
Well, great. Thank you, Clay. I did have a comment when you were talking about Oracle and VMware. Yesterday, the last session of yesterday, we did have a speaker from VMware, and he was talking about this very issue in terms of the licensing agreements and so on. So if anybody is interested in hearing more about what Clay was speaking on, when we get the Data Summit Connect videos up on YouTube, please go take a look at that. It was pretty interesting. Licensing is a fascinating topic. I also had a question. Your 1-800-Flowers example. How do you guarantee that they're not going to do something right before your biggest sales day?
Well, again, not specifically 800-Flowers, but I do know some customers that have actually, some of our larger customers have actually written that into cloud contracts. They say, we're buying this service from you, and Mr. Cloud Vendor, you will not degrade that service or perform updates or changes, during these periods of time. So you can actually do that if you're large enough to be able to negotiate with a cloud vendor, or if you're doing a cloud at customer or an on-premise cloud, you can certainly control that kind of thing. And that might be one reason why you would want to go with an on-premise cloud for that, is for just that kind of reason. Otherwise, most vendors, all the cloud vendors I'm aware of, are pretty open, and unless there's an emergency or something, and acts of God and things happen, right? But for planned maintenance, they're really pretty open about that. And I know that I have some stuff in the cloud for personal stuff, and I get notices 2 weeks in advance that something's going to happen, and so I can make arrangements, either move my data or have it available where I can raise my hand to the vendor and say, hey, that's not really a good time for me. When might you be able to do this, or how might I be able to mitigate that? And you can work with the vendor, but the big thing is you have to be aware of it and know about it and pay attention to it. Otherwise, you might get blindsided.
Is it better to specify a day? Don't do anything on these days, or is it better to just say you must give me 5 days notice or 72 hours or something like that before you make a change?
It's going to kind of depend on the nature of your business and what the environments are. I mean, again, if you're a retailer and you have a retail site, now of course it's different. Cyber Monday is probably going to be more important than Black Friday, but in this current environment. But normally, you'd say, well, gee, we don't want to have you doing anything for the day before and the day after Black, the whole Thanksgiving period. You want to freeze things. So there you might specify. Otherwise, you might say, okay, and again, maybe not specify, but just make sure so you and the cloud vendor agree that, yeah, I know I'm going to get 72 hours notice or a week's notice or whatever, and then pay attention to it. Don't just delete that email from the cloud vendor.
Oh, that would be a bad idea. Yes, that would be a really bad idea.
Yeah.
We have a question about governance, and this is sort of a broad question, so I'm not sure exactly how you're going to handle this one.
Okay.
Just can you comment on governance of big data in the cloud? What are the trends in governance, I guess, might be a better way to approach that question.
Well, they're kind of all over the map, and I guess what's driving a lot of the data governance things these days, or at least at first, is regulations. Okay. Where you have very specific regulations, and HIPAA is probably the biggest place. They seem to be furthest along. HHS seems to be the furthest along in terms of how that's regulated and the specifications they have. So, for example, they have things that say that, okay, if your data is going to be at rest and your at rest data location is provided to you by a third party, you have to be sure that third party complies with the same HIPAA regulations that you would as if it was in your location or on site. So that immediately is going to trigger some governance things that are going to have to happen. Then beyond that, there's Sarbanes-Oxley and some of those things, and sort of the same rules apply from the business standpoint, but now you've got a third party that's got to be in the negotiations and involved in it. And most of the cloud vendors, Amazon and Microsoft and Oracle and Google are all, right up to speed, and they're current with this stuff. They're following the FIPS standards and the other, the PCI standards and all those things, and they have certifications, or they have certain pieces of their environment that are certified in that way. So for example, Amazon, if you go into the Amazon government cloud, they'll guarantee FIPS compliance and things in their government cloud. So that may make that's going to help you make a decision as to which piece of the Amazon cloud you get into. If you're a government organization with secret data, you're going to be restricted and only be able to do certain things, as opposed to, unclassified data or other things that are going to be in a more open environment. So again, it's an awareness thing as much as anything else.
Yeah, but don't we also have governments that are saying, well, we don't quite trust this country, so we're going to require, even though it's the cloud, that your data lives in our country?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the government and the whole transnational data flow issue is becoming more and more critical. And again, you know, what that means to the cloud customer is that you've got to be aware of what's going on and where you're putting your data and what the cloud vendor can then do with that data. And, you know, again, both Microsoft and Amazon, I'm familiar with those two specifically, have, you know, you can choose not only your primary location and where your data is going to be to begin with, you can also tell Amazon or Microsoft, you know, this data has to stay inside the US or in this country or that country. You know, you can't move the data out, and they'll do that for you, you know, but again, you have to pay for it and you have to be aware of it.
But you have to instigate that.
Yes, yeah.
As a customer, yeah.
Or again, be aware that they're, you know, they're not going to do that for you. Just if you just pick an East Coast data center for Amazon, there's no guarantee that tomorrow, unless you specify it and set it up that way, configure it that way, there's no guarantee that tomorrow that data is not going to be in Europe or in the Middle East somewhere, you know, or the Far East in China or something like that. You know, no guarantee that's not going to happen unless you specify it.
Okay, all right. Buyer beware.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Well, be aware, not necessarily beware, but be aware.
Okay. Let me see if we have any other questions coming in here. Does anyone else have a question for Clay? Data in the cloud, we did that one. I guess when you were talking about security, I am curious about, in the last 6 or 7 months, have you seen customers being more worried about security of data in the cloud or less worried about security of data in the cloud?
Maybe not customers being more or less worried, but more customers being worried, I guess is a being
worried in general.
Yeah, being worried in general, or being worried about security in the cloud. In other words, you know, as cloud adoption continues to broaden and we see more and more customers getting into the cloud, security is always one of their concerns. You know, I wouldn't say that it's trending any worse or any better. You know, the bad guys are out there, they're getting more sophisticated, but so are the cloud vendors, and they're all keeping track of that. And it's kind of a, you know, an ongoing battle or tug of war there. But I guess, like I say, I wouldn't say it's going either better or worse, but everybody is worried about it. Everybody's concerned about it. Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh well, I guess that's part of the way of the world as it is today.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah. Well, let me thank Clay for a very enlightening presentation. And thanks also to our diamond sponsor, Sumo Logic. Stay tuned for our next session in Data Summit Connect, which will be coming up in just about half an hour. So see you then, and thank you again, Clay.
Thank you all very much. Glad to do it. Thanks.